I'm a licensed professional counselor, and this is my mental health analysis of the William Stevenson case. These are my speculations.
The Clinical File with John Cordray.
What happens when a person carries forward unresolved pain from a past relationship into a new marriage that spans decades? And how might that lingering bitterness shape the way they respond to conflict in their later years? In domestic cases involving long-term partners, we sometimes observe patterns where early relational wounds, such as betrayal or abandonment, remain unprocessed, quietly influencing how someone perceives threats to their control or self-worth in subsequent partnerships. This question gets to the heart of attachment wounds and their long shadow, and today I will walk through evidence suggesting how such dynamics can contribute to tragic outcomes. In this episode of the Clinical File, you'll see the behavioral clues that point to deeper emotional strains. William Bill Stevenson was married to Jill Biden, then Jill Jacobs, from February 1970 until their divorce in May 1975. She was 18 at the time of their wedding, and he was 23. The marriage lasted 5 years before they separated, and Jill later married Joe Biden in 1977. Stevenson has spoken publicly about feeling betrayed during that period, including claims that Jill had an affair with Joe Biden before their divorce was final. These statements, given in interviews over the years, shows a persistent focus on that chapter of his life. From a psychological standpoint, holding on to resentment for such a long time can indicate difficulty letting go of perceived injustices. When someone repeatedly revisits a past betrayal, it often signals an insecure attachment style formed earlier in life, where trust feels fragile and slights get magnified. Stevenson's willingness to discuss the divorce publicly, even decades later, might reflect a pattern of externalizing blame rather than internalizing and processing the pain. This pattern becomes relevant when we consider his second marriage to Linda Stevenson. While the exact start date of the relationship is not widely documented, they were married for many years, and Linda was 64 at the time of her death on December 28, 2025, while Stevenson was 77. The significant age difference and the length of the marriage suggests a partnership that endured through different life stages, including his success founding the Stone Balloon music venue in Newark, Delaware, which hosted major brands in the 1970s. On December 9th, police responded to a domestic dispute call at their home in Oak Hill community near Wilmington around 11:15 p.m. Stevenson himself placed the 911 call. Officers found Linda unresponsive on the living room floor, and despite efforts to revive her, she was pronounced dead at the scene. Her body went to the Delaware Division of Forensic Science for the autopsy, although the cause of death has not been publicly detailed. A weeks-long investigation followed, involving coordination with the State Department of Justice. On February 1, 2026, Stephen was arrested at home without incident. The next day, on February 2nd, a grand jury in Newcastle County indicted him on one count of first-degree murder. He remains held at Howard Young Correctional Institution after failing to post a $500,000 cash bail. In this episode of the Clinical File, I'll examine the mental health indicators of this case. Although this is not a diagnosis, it's purely my speculation. The fact that Stephen made the emergency call himself adds nuance to the psychological picture. In some domestic homicide cases, the alleged perpetrator initiates contact with authorities to shape the initial narrative as one of concern or accident. This can tie into an impression management, which is a behavior sometimes seen when someone believes their version of the events will hold up under scrutiny. It might stem from overconfidence and controlling perceptions, which forensic psychology links to certain personality traits where self-image overrides realistic assessment of consequences. The plan appeared to rely on an oppressive level of optimism regarding forensic science and investigative thoroughness. Linda's obituary, published around January 14, 2026, described her as tenacious, kind-hearted, and fiercely loyal. She ran a bookkeeping business, loved the Philadelphia Eagles, and was deeply devoted to her family. Notably, the obituary made no mention of her husband, William Stevenson. It focused exclusively on her blood relatives and her own qualities while noting that she passed away unexpectedly. This omission stands out as unusual in standard obituaries for married individuals. From a psychological perspective, it could reflect family members' awareness of significant marital strain or even prior concerns about safety. In victimology, loved ones sometimes pick up on subtle red flags such as controlling behaviors, emotional withdrawal, or escalating arguments long before outsiders do. By excluding a spouse from the memorial notice, the family may have been making a quiet but deliberate statement of allegiance to Linda's independence and her core support network. Such actions often arise when there has been a history of emotional and psychological control within the relationship. Perpetrators in these dynamics may isolate partners over time, leading to fractured family ties. Linda's obituary emphasizes her role as a mother and grandmother and suggests she maintains strong bonds outside the marriage, which can serve as a protective factor but does not always prevent tragedy when conflict reaches a breaking point. Stevenson's first marriage ended in divorce after 5 years amid reported bitterness. Public comments he made years later indicated lingering anger toward Jill Biden, whom he described in harsh terms. This prolonged fixation on a past relationship raises questions about unresolved grief or betrayal trauma. In mental health terms, when someone cannot release resentment, it can spill over into current interactions, creating a lens through which new partners are viewed with suspicion or as potential sources of further hurt. Abandonment fears, possibly intensified by the end of his first marriage, might have amplified sensitivity to any perceived threats in his marriage to Linda. Psychological research shows that individuals with histories of relational loss sometimes develop hypervigilance towards signs of rejection or independence in their partners. If Linda's bookkeeping business or family connections represented autonomy, it could have triggered defensive responses rooted in those earlier wounds. At 77, Stevenson was navigating later life transitions, retirement, physical aging, and possible shifts in identity after a successful entrepreneurial career. These stages can exacerbate underlying issues like depression, anxiety, or irritability if emotional regulation has been a lifelong challenge. Untreated, such strain sometimes manifests in heightened conflict, especially during arguments over finances, health, or household roles common in older couples. The indictment specifies first-degree murder, meaning intentional causation of death with premeditated or deliberation under Delaware law. Psychologically, intentional acts in domestic contexts often follow a buildup of rage or desperation rather than a spontaneous impulse alone. Triggers might include a specific dispute that felt like an existential threat to control or status. This appears to be another example of how timeless strategy of attempting to outsmart investigators who literally do this for a living. Stevenson's public persona as a driven businessman who built a notable revenue suggests a personality that values attachment and perhaps compartmentalization of personal emotions. High-achieving individuals sometimes suppress feelings until pressure builds, leading to explosive releases. If this pattern existed, minor conflicts could escalate when accumulated stress overwhelmed coping mechanisms. The domestic dispute call itself points to a flashpoint. Police records indicate officers arrived to find a crisis already underway. In many such cases, arguments stem from long simmering issues, money, independence, or perceived betrayals that echo past relational pain. Connecting the dots, Stevenson's fixation on his first divorce might have created a template for interpreting Linda's actions, projecting old hurts onto the present. From a victim perspective, Linda's described resilience and loyalty likely helped her navigate challenges, yet staying in a strained marriage can involve complex psychological factors, emotional bonds, financial ties, and fear of upheaval later in years, or even hope for improvement. Women in long-term relationships sometimes maintain outward normalcy while internal dynamics erode, a coping strategy that masks distress. The psychological impact on survivors, Linda's daughter, granddaughter, and sister, includes compounded grief with sudden loss mixed with suspicion. Processing betrayal trauma requires specialized support to rebuild trust and safety. For the accused, custody at this age brings isolation, potential regret, and mental health challenges like depression. Court proceedings may eventually include psychiatric evaluations, shedding more light on any underlying conditions. This case illustrates the classic mismatch between perceived cleverness and actual detectability. Modern forensics, digital records, and witness accounts often reveal inconsistencies that initial narratives cannot withstand. One particular observation stands out here. Humans continue to demonstrate remarkable creativity when explaining away inconvenient evidence, yet objective facts have a way of persisting. The obituary omission of William serves as a potential aha moment here. It suggests a family intuition about discord, perhaps long before the fatal night. Combined with the domestic call, the weeks-long probe, and the indictment, it paints a relationship under chronic strain. Why might someone with apparent outward success allegedly reach such an extreme? A sense of entitlement to control outcomes, possibly rooted in past losses, can distort judgment. When perceived threats arise, defensive aggression overrides empathy. Recognizing the red flags like persistent blame shifting, isolation attempts, or fixation on past grievances matter in any relationship. This case, with its ties to a high-profile figure through Stevenson's first marriage, reminds us that private pain exists behind public success. Mental health indicators often appear in everyday patterns long before tragedy. This is a high-profile case because of Jill Biden and her alleged affair with Joe Biden and why they got divorced. So that part is the high profile here. But even in high-profile cases, these are still human beings. They still have human emotions. And here we see William, he was charged, he was indicted for the murder of his second wife. We don't have all of the evidence, or at least the evidence is not fully known yet, but it does suggest that there was a lot of things going behind the doors, behind closed doors. Their marriage obviously was strained, and that clue of omitting him from the obituary memorial, that's very interesting, very telling in my view. So what did you think about this case? Were there any elements that stood out to you? Thank you for joining me today. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe.